Ooh. Kapow.
When Ruth first met Naomi, she was surrounded by a family filled with grief. Some time ago, the family had been forced to leave Bethlehem and go to Moab because of a famine. And then Naomi's husband, Elimelech, somehow died. Naomi did not take it very well. But years passed, and her sons Marlin and Kilian both married Moabite women, Ruth and Orpah. But then the brothers died. Also under unknown circumstances. After this, the three women lived together in Moab, until one day they were told that the famine in Judah was over. Given her present circumstances, Naomi supposed there was nothing better to do than return home. She began packing immediately. It took them a moment to realize that there was no real reason Orpah and Ruth should join her. In fact, it was ill-advised. Under Jewish law, they'd be required to marry their dead husband's brothers. But since their dead husbands were one another's brothers, things could get rather complicated. Naomi encouraged Orpah and Ruth to remain in Moab, as there was no real future for them in Bethlehem. Orpah chose to stay in Moab. However, Ruth could not bring herself to desert Naomi, and insisted that she stay by Naomi's side indefinitely.
Where you go, I will go. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die.
Wow.
As a Moabite woman, the welcome that Ruth received in Bethlehem lacked a certain luster. Any joy in Naomi's homecoming was cut short by the realization that they were now two destitute widows, with no way to support themselves. Ruth, realizing the gravity of their situation, asked if she could glean the fields, which in those days was how many of the poor survived, by following behind harvesting farmers and gathering leftover grain. These particular fields were owned by a man named Boaz. Boaz was a religious man, a rich man, a generous man, a smart man. Well, at least that's how he thought of himself.
The Lord be with you.
No matter what Ruth thought of him personally, he did offer her protection and safety. He took pity on this hard-working foreign girl. Ruth found his displays quite endearing, if not a bit amusing. Ruth told Naomi about her day. Naomi realized the man Ruth had worked for was Boaz, her kinsman. If perchance Ruth were to somehow marry Boaz, they would both be well cared for. So Naomi developed a scheme whereby Ruth, in the night, would sneak onto the threshing floor and lay at Boaz's feet. It was a dangerous plan. If Boaz was pleased to find her there, then all would be well. But he could just as well take offence to her advances and want nothing to do with her, or even accuse her of adultery, which was a capital offence. All risks aside, there was also the issue of Boaz himself. Boaz was not a young man. However, Ruth realized that whether or not Boaz was her first choice for a husband, he was clearly the best chance she had to support Naomi, and so she selflessly agreed to the plan. Ruth's first obstacle was to get past a man who referred to himself as the guard of the threshing floor. Before long, Boaz returned from a feast and fell asleep. This was the most dangerous part. If anyone else saw her there, they'd assume she was a prostitute, which would ruin her chances of marrying anyone, let alone Boaz. The plan was working flawlessly. Having succeeded, it was unclear to Ruth as to how exactly laying at Boaz's feet was going to lead to marriage. Ruth decided that whatever was going to happen, she might as well get on with it. Boaz couldn't tell who it was in the dark, but was glad to learn it was Ruth. As Ruth and Boaz spoke through the night, Ruth realized that Boaz, while a bit eccentric, was indeed a good man.
I like you, Ruth.
I like you too.
There was one little matter, however. One kinsman stood ahead of Boaz in the line to inherit Ruth. Boaz pledged to deal with the matter. In order to make a smooth transition from their exploits on the threshing room floor, Boaz had to convince his kinsman, who we'll call Nigel, to give up his inheritance of not only Ruth, but all of the land that Naomi's family owned in Judah. Boaz decided to utilize the classic bait-and-switch strategy, explaining that Naomi's land was indeed for sale to her nearest kinsman. But if Nigel bought the land, by law, he would also have to marry Ruth.
It's a very complicated situation.
Nigel agreed to let Boaz buy the land and gave him his sandal to confirm the transaction.
Whatever.
And so Boaz and Ruth were free to marry. And it wasn't long before they had a child named Obed. And Naomi had a grandchild, which didn't bring her sons and husband back, but did make her feel a little less bitter. As for Ruth, she did as she promised. Where Naomi went, she went. Naomi's people were her people, and Naomi's God, her God. And when Naomi died, Ruth, sometime later, died. Somehow. And what of Obed, her son? Obed went on to have a son named Jesse, who was the father of King David. David was the father of Solomon, who was the father of Rehoboam, who was the father of Abijah. 23 equally unpronounceable generations later, Jacob was father to Joseph, whom you may better know as husband to Mary, mother of Jesus of Nazareth. And thus, in about 800 short years, Ruth went from Moabite outcast to Christian ancestor in the truest sense of the word.